My name is Tiffany Mitchell, and I was born into a seemingly typical middle-class family in a quiet suburban neighborhood where neat lawns and white fences created the illusion of a calm, measured life. But behind the closed doors of our cozy home, a storm of parental ambitions boiled over, striving for their children to become something more. More than just happy people. My parents, David and Sarah Mitchell, were obsessed with early childhood development techniques, enthusiastically buying books, articles, and manuals that promised to make their offspring prodigies who could solve complex mathematical problems even before they could tie their shoes. And day after day they scrupulously followed all these tips, as if they had not raised a child, but some kind of ambitious project that requires strict control and careful planning. I remember my mother, with shining eyes and genuine enthusiasm, reading aloud new theories about the cognitive development of toddlers, making notes in her thick notebooks, which no longer had room for diagrams, lists, and complex diagrams, and Dad, who initially tried to show skepticism, soon succumbed to her insistence and also took part in this. They ran a marathon for intellectual excellence, hanging colorful cards around the house with letters, numbers, and even formulas that they believed were supposed to penetrate my subconscious and make me special. But despite all their efforts, I grew up as a very ordinary child. I sat down, walked and spoke exactly in the time frame that is considered average, and, of course, I did not show any signs of genius, which seemed to be the first disappointment for them, the first hint that their methodology might not be at work as they expected. Everything changed when my younger sister Jessica was born, and if before Mom and Dad could somehow convince themselves that their efforts would bear fruit later, now they have a chance to start all over again, correcting the mistakes that they thought were made during my upbringing. And at that time, the moment our house finally turned into a training camp for future geniuses. Unlike me, who had ordinary dolls and soft toys, Jessica had got special educational kits aimed at stimulating intelligence. Instead of good fairy tales and colorful books, she received materials designed to improve her cognitive abilities, and her every milestone, whether it was the first word or hesitant steps, was met with such intense joy, as if she had made a scientific discovery. But fortunately, there was a place in my life where I felt loved not for my achievements, but simply for who I am, and that place became the home of my grandparents, Peter and Eleanor Mitchell, who lived just a few blocks away and always treated Jessica and me equally, showering us both with affection, attention, and homemade cakes. I still remember one warm Sunday afternoon when I was about 5 years old. My sister and I were sitting next to each other on a soft sofa, and Grandma Eleanor, warming us with her calm voice, read an old book of fairy tales, stroking my hair and repeating that both of her granddaughters were beautiful the way they are, and it seemed to me that in this house I could just breathe, without having to meet anyone's expectations. However, her mother clearly did not share her views, and every time her grandmother said that children needed love, not pressure, a tense expression appeared on her face, and her lips pressed into a thin line, especially when it came to Jessica, who, in her opinion, demonstrated outstanding potential that should not be missed. I remember one family dinner when my grandmother, no longer holding back, firmly stated that children are not scientific experiments, that they should grow up happy, and not driven into the framework of strict methods, and I saw my mother flare up, accusing her of being old-fashioned, and Dad rushed to her defense, stating that they just wanted to give Jessica a better future. But at that moment I already understood that in their eyes I was just a trial version, a draft, before they could create the perfect masterpiece. School turned out to be quite ordinary for me. I didn't shine, but I didn't lag behind. I had friends with whom I spent time. I studied for solid B's and sometimes got an A, and, on the whole, I was happy that I was just living the life of a normal child, but my parents barely honored my report cards. It was clear to me that no amount of good grades would make them proud of me the way they were proud of Jessica, who, unlike me, went to school in a completely different way. I spent months studying colleges, filling out applications, rereading requirements, comparing programs, reading reviews, and imagining how I would finally find myself in a world where I would be valued not as a shadow of someone's genius, but as an independent person, where no one would compare my successes with my sister's achievements, where each of my the victory would belong only to me. But the more I delved into this process, the more I realized that my parents were not interested at all. That all conversations over dinner invariably boiled down to Jessica and her dizzying prospects, to her impeccable resume full of awards, her Olympiads, her tutors, her chances of getting into the best universities in the country. And when I once dared to talk about my plans, that I wanted to study journalism, that I was interested in writing, that I wanted to go into the creative field, my mother just shrugged and said that it's not serious, that journalism, it's not a profession, it's just a hobby that I can do in my free time, so I should choose something more promising. And then, before I could object, I went back to discussing how many points Jessica scored on the last mock test. But the most annoying thing was not even that, but the fact that when it came time to apply, I found out that my parents had already made a decision for me, without asking my opinion, without even bothering to ask what I wanted, because all the financing, all the savings that I thought were intended for our education, both of them were aimed at paying Jessica for a place at one of the prestigious Ivy League universities, while I was offered to consider a local college, more affordable, less high-profile, but, in their opinion, sufficient for a person who did not demonstrate outstanding academic achievements. I could feel something breaking inside me, anger mixing with disappointment, anger throbbing in my temples, but even then I didn't throw a tantrum, demand justice, scream, or seek recognition, because I knew that in this house I would always be in the background, would never get the best room, the best university, the best opportunities, because they decided from the very beginning that I wasn't worth it, that I was just a draft, and Jessica was their perfect piece. While my sister was talking with shining eyes about her future life on campus, how she was going to join an elite student club, how she was going to participate in programs for the best students in the country, and how she had already chosen an expensive apartment near the university, I filled out an application for a part-time job at a local cafe, realizing that if I wanted to leave, if I want to break out, I'll have to do it myself, without their support, without their money, without their approval. They didn't say they were proud of me, they didn't ask how I felt, they didn't ask what I wanted, they just told me that they had helped Jessica choose a new laptop for her studies. And at that moment I realized that I no longer wanted to fight for their attention. I didn't want to prove that I was worthy too. Because no matter how hard I try, it will never be enough for them. When the day of Jessica's farewell dinner came before her departure, my parents booked a table at an expensive restaurant, where they solemnly raised glasses in her honor to the sound of live music, congratulating her on the beginning of a great journey, on future achievements, and on the fact that she would become the one they had always dreamed of seeing her. And I sat across from her, picking at my fork on my plate, knowing that I'm leaving in a year, but no one will arrange such an evening for me, no one will raise a toast, no one will wish me a bright future, because in their eyes my path was secondary, not worth much attention. When I returned home and locked myself in my tiny room, littered with boxes of my modest belongings, I was overwhelmed by a wave of realization. In a few months I will leave here, I will leave this house, these walls, this constant atmosphere of comparison and disappointment. I will begin to build my life the way I want, without their intervention, without their control, without their expectations, and maybe I'll finally feel free. I looked at my grandmother in disbelief, not understanding how this was possible, how they were willing to invest so much money in me when even my own parents considered it a waste. But in her eyes I saw no hesitation, no doubt, only warm, unconditional love, the very one that I felt it when I was a child, sitting on her lap, listening to her fairy tales and eating homemade cookies. And although my heart still ached from the betrayal of my parents, at that moment I realized that I had a real family, those who were always there for me, who saw me not as a secondary option, not a failed experiment, but just a man worthy of happiness and a future. Grandma kept talking, her voice was soft but firm. She explained that she and Grandpa had been saving money for many years, that they had enough money to help me, that nothing was more important to them than to see me happy and realize my dreams. And when I tried to object, to say that it was it's too big a sacrifice, that I can't accept such help, she just shook her head and reminded me that parents are obligated to support their children, and if my own mother and father refuse this responsibility, then they and my grandfather will take it on themselves, because I've always been important to them, I've always been loved, and no grades, or diplomas could change that. I burst into tears, but they were no longer tears of pain, but rather of relief, gratitude, albeit with a bitter taste of the realization that my real parents had never really needed me, that their love had always been conditioned by achievements, successes, and not just my existence. But even so, I knew that now I have a chance, now I have a path that I can walk, knowing that there are people behind me who really believe in me. The next morning, I went down to breakfast, ready for a new wave of coldness from my parents, but to my surprise, they didn't even bother to return to yesterday's conversation. They didn't care that I was going to study, that I had the means to study, because all their energy, all their pride, all their affections were still focused on Jessica, who enthusiastically talked about how she would prepare for the first year, and I just watched them in silence, no longer trying to squeeze into this narrow world of their ambitions, understanding that my life was going to take a completely different path from now on. The next few months flew by in a rush. I threw myself into preparing for admission, filling out forms, sending essays, collecting documents, and although I sometimes had doubts, although I still heard my parents' voices in my head saying that I was ordinary and would not achieve anything special, every time these thoughts began to depress me, I remembered my grandmother's words, her confidence that I deserved it, and it gave me the strength to move forward. When the day of the results announcement came, I opened the letter with such excitement that my hands were shaking, and when I saw the cherished "congratulations," my heart beat so fast that it seemed it could jump out of my chest. I was accepted to where I wanted, and even if it wasn't Legovsky University, it wasn't Harvard, wasn't Stanford, but it was my place, my chance, my door to a new life. I remember running to my grandparents that day, how they hugged me, how my grandfather slapped me on the shoulder, smiling proudly, how my grandmother, wiping away her tears, repeated that she always knew that everything would work out for me, and at that moment I felt really happy because I understood that I was moving forward not to prove something to anyone, but because I wanted to. The day of my departure came. I stood at the door of the house in which I had lived all my life, looked at the walls that had heard my disappointment, my pain, my attempts to earn love so many times. But now I knew that I would no longer return here as the same Tiffany I had been before. I would become different, stronger, freer, and when I walked out the door without looking back, I felt the wind pick me up, filling my chest with a feeling I had never experienced before, a feeling of real, complete freedom. But Jessica just rolled her eyes and said that she just needed time, that she was figuring herself out, that the strict confines of the university were overwhelming her, and now that she was finally free, she wanted to live for herself, enjoy life, and get a taste of independence, even though her independence consisted only in to spend her parents' money on branded clothes, expensive cocktails, and endless parties, after which she returned home in the early morning, not hiding either her irritation or contempt for her parents, who suddenly began to demand at least some responsibility from her. I listened to all this, and there was no bloating or desire to mock me, but deep down I couldn't help but notice the bitter irony in what was happening. All these years Mom and Dad had been telling me that I wasn't good enough, that I was ordinary, that I wasn't worth their investment, that there was real potential. Only Jessica, they had invested everything in her, money, time, resources, their blind, fanatical faith in her exclusivity, and now they faced a reality that they did not know how to deal with. Their ideal daughter turned out to be completely unprepared for life, for independence, for decision-making, because she was used to having everything decided for her, that any obstacle could be overcome with the promise of a new car, a new phone, or any financial bribe, but this time their methods no longer worked. Grandma said that her father tried to get her a job at a friend's company, but Jessica didn't last 2 weeks there, saying she wasn't going to sit around in some boring office, that she deserved more, that she wanted to find a real vocation, but of course, the search for a vocation. It consisted solely of endless whims, in refusing to do at least something that did not bring instant pleasure, and in the expectation that sooner or later the universe would throw her an ideal option where nothing needed to be done, but at the same time money and status would come into her hands. I imagined the faces of the parents, their shock, their impotent anger, their utter bewilderment that their system, their carefully constructed mechanism for creating the perfect child, had failed, that their upbringing, their principles, Their control had not led to the expected result, and probably in the past I would have felt satisfied, having seen their illusion crumble. But now, being away from all this, building my own life, I just felt that it had nothing to do with me anymore. In college, I became more and more confident in myself. Studying was easy for me, especially courses related to analytics, economics, investments. I plunged headlong into subjects that really fascinated me, and even started working part-time at one of the startups, doing market research, immersing myself in what really aroused my interest. It wasn't imposed from the outside, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was moving in the right direction, not because someone told me it was important, not because I was trying to prove something to my parents, but because I needed it myself. When I called my grandmother again and heard the tiredness in her voice, I immediately realized that something was wrong, and of course it was related to Jessica again. She turned into a real nightmare for the whole family. Her inaction annoyed even her parents, who were used to pleasing her, but now that they were faced with the fact that their daughter was not going to do anything useful, even they began to lose patience. And, according to her grandmother, one day at dinner, her father raised his voice at her for the first time, demanding that she stop acting like a spoiled child. Jessica exploded, shouting that they had made her like this, that they had taught her that everything in life could be paid for, that they had taught her that she was special, that she deserved more than a simple office job, than boring duties, than the life of an ordinary person, and that now that their methods no longer work, they have no right to demand changes from her. I listened to all this, and a strange feeling grew in me, not exactly pity, but something like understanding, because in a sense, Jessica was also a victim of their ambitions. But if I got indifference, then she got unhealthy adoration, which turned out to be no less destructive. And now in front of me the picture of the collapse of their ideal world was unfolding, in which one daughter was supposed to be a genius, and the other, mediocre. But this world no longer existed because the genius daughter did not meet their expectations, and the one they did not notice went ahead without their approval, without their help, simply because she chose this path. A few weeks later, Grandma said that after another scandal, Jessica packed up and left home, saying that she did not intend to live in an atmosphere where she was no longer appreciated, that she would find her way without pressure and expectations, that now she wanted to decide for herself how to live. But, of course, at the same time, she did not give up her parents' credit card, continuing to use their money without worrying about what would happen next. Her parents were in a panic, calling her, begging her to come back, trying to lure her with gifts again. But for the first time in her life, Jessica seemed to have decided that she no longer wanted to play by their rules, and this time their methods really didn't work anymore. I looked at her expression of triumph, at that smug gleam in her eyes, at how she literally savored every second, trying to read on my face at least a shadow of envy or irritation, but there was none of it. There was no jealousy, no resentment, no desire to compete in this senseless race that she had invented for herself, because, unlike her, I had long ago chosen completely different guidelines for myself. I did not seek confirmation of my importance in someone's admiring glances. I did not measure my value by the number of compliments or as an external attribute of success. I was just living my life, building my career, reaching new heights, and I didn't need to prove to someone that I was better. It was enough for me that I was myself. Charles seemed to be one of those people who are commonly called respectable, well-dressed, confident, with practiced manners, with a light, unobtrusive smile that said he knew his own worth perfectly well, but in his gaze, full of courteous interest, I saw something else. What there was a shadow of doubt, a kind of caution, as if he was trying to probe the ground, to figure out what game Jessica was playing now and what role I was playing in this game. "It's very nice to meet you," he finally said, holding out his hand to me, and I shook it, noticing how Jessica immediately glared at me, looking for the slightest sign of emotion, but I just nodded politely, not succumbing to her obvious provocation, and, to her obvious disappointment, switched back to dinner, continuing to eat as if nothing special had happened. Of course, his parents immediately began asking Charles about his work, family, and future plans, and he responded with easy, impeccable courtesy, telling them about his position in financial consulting, trips to Europe, and his love of expensive wine and yachting, while Jessica literally glowed. Out of pride, squeezing his hand and, at every opportunity, inserting comments into the conversation about how great they were having a great time together, what gorgeous gifts he was giving her, what restaurants they visited. But I saw that there was something else behind this carefully crafted picture, some invisible tension, some subtle discrepancy, as if there was something fragile, something shaky, something that could collapse at the slightest wrong move. Movement. After dinner, my parents were delighted. My mother did not stop repeating what of a worthy young man Charles was, how lucky Jessica was, how good it was that she finally got her wits about her and chose a promising man. And I looked at them, listened to this stream of admiring comments, and could not to notice how much they wanted to believe that everything was finally going according to their script again, that their golden girl had found a path that corresponded to their ideas of a proper of life, that they could be proud of her again, as before. But even then, even seeing, as they desperately cling to this illusion, I understood that this was just a temporary lull, because Jessica, as before, had not changed. She had not become a different person. She had just found another way to escape reality, and this way, as always, was for someone else to taking responsibility for her life. And I was not mistaken. A few months passed, and Charles increasingly began to appear at family dinners in a gloomy mood. His politeness became more and more strained, his smile lost its sincerity, and Jessica, who had recently boasted of their perfect relationship, increasingly averted her eyes when the conversation turned to the future. And one day, when I went to my grandparents' house after work to have tea with them, I found my grandmother sitting in the living room with her phone in her hands, and an expression on her face that I immediately recognized. It was the same face she made when she was trying to decide whether she should tell me the news or not. "What happened?" I asked, taking off my coat, and she sighed, putting her phone on the table. "Charles left Jessica," she said, and there was no gloating in her voice, just weariness. I wasn't surprised. "And how did she take it?" Grandma shook her head. "As always. He says he just didn't realize how special she was, that he didn't appreciate her, that he was a pathetic, boring financier who didn't know anything about life." I chuckled, because this answer was so predictable that it didn't even make sense to comment on it, but Grandma continued. "But this time it's a little more complicated. You see, they live together in his apartment, and now she has nowhere to go." I raised my eyebrows. "You mean?" "She went back to her parents," Grandma finished, and now there was a clear irritation in her voice. And now this whole perfect picture, which Jessica had been building so diligently, had finally collapsed. Her promising man was tired of her whims, her constant demands, her inability to do anything on her own, and now she was back where she had been years earlier, in her parents' house, who probably they didn't know whether to be happy about it or not. I didn't feel schadenfreude. I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel anything but a little regret, because I knew she had a chance to change her life. But she didn't use it, and now everything is back to normal. When the day of the party came, I drove up to my parents' house, and I was greeted by a completely different picture than I had imagined, because instead of a cozy family celebration with close relatives and friends, I saw a real social event. Luxurious tables with snow-white tablecloths, professional waiters in uniforms serving champagne on trays, expensive live music, and a crowd of people I didn't even know, but who seemed to be connected with my parents' business circles, their partners, investors, and old acquaintances. And in the center of all this splendor stood a beaming mother who, when she saw me, she immediately rushed towards me, opening her arms. "Oh, darling, isn't that wonderful?" she exclaimed, gesturing at the whole situation. "I thought it would be a great opportunity not only to celebrate your success, but also to introduce you to the right people. You are now such an important person in the investment world, and the right connections are the key to the future." I looked at her and realized that this was not my holiday, not my evening, but another opportunity for parents to showcase themselves and their family in a positive light, to convince others that their children are successful, worthy people to be proud of, and I am their triumph, their brilliant investment, which finally, it started to pay dividends. I took a deep breath, trying not to let my irritation get the better of me, because in the end, Despite the fact that this was clearly not what I had planned, there really were a lot of influential people in this room whom it might be useful for me to get to know, and instead of making a scene, I decided to just take advantage of the situation, use it to your advantage, while maintaining an outward calm. Half an hour later, I was already having a conversation with a partner of one of the largest venture funds, discussing the potential of investing in technology startups, when I heard a familiar voice behind me, filled with poorly concealed sarcasm. "Well, Miss Careerist, are you enjoying your finest hour?" I turned around and saw Jessica, who was standing next to Charles, looking immaculate as always, but her eyes betrayed tension. She was clutching a glass of wine a little tighter than she should have been, and a strange smile was playing on her lips, a mixture of mockery and envy. "Thank you for coming," I replied calmly, not giving in to provocation. "Well, how could I miss such an event?" Her voice was deliberately casual. "After all, it's not every day that my sister becomes, what is it? The investment director?" Charles gave her a quick glance, which I noticed but didn't comment on, although there was obvious disapproval in it. Even he seemed to be getting tired of her constant need to compete. "Exactly," I nodded, still smiling. "I hope you're not being arrogant," she added with forced lightness, but her tone gave her away. "And I hope you'll find something that will bring you real satisfaction," I replied, and a flash of anger flashed in her eyes. But before she could say anything else, one of my boss's colleagues came up to us, holding out his hand to me with a smile. "Tiffany, you're amazing. What you did with the portfolio restructuring was an ingenious step. We are all impressed." Jessica froze in place, her face fell, and I saw her press her lips together, and then, turning abruptly, pulled Charles by the arm, dragging him away. I didn't stop her. The evening was great. I met a lot of people, heard a lot of flattering words about my work, felt like I belonged, and at some point even forgot about my parents, who, of course, seized every chance to brag about me in front of their friends, pretending that they always supported me and believed in my success. As the guests began to leave, I approached my grandmother, who was sitting contentedly in an armchair by the fireplace, sipping tea. "Well, how do you like the show?" I asked, sitting down next to him. She laughed. "Honey, you were just great, but I hope you understand that your mom turned this evening not into your celebration, but into her presentation." "Of course I understand," I grinned. Grandma looked at me carefully and, nodding, squeezed my hand. "The main thing is that you now know that you can achieve everything on your own." The next day, I woke up feeling light. For the first time in a long time, I realized that all these family dramas, this eternal rivalry with Jessica, this parental approval that I had been trying to get for so long, all this no longer mattered to me. I stood on my own path, and this path was only mine. All eyes turned to me at once, surprised, dumbfounded, displeased, perplexed, but I couldn't stop, couldn't force myself to swallow the humiliation, to pretend that this was normal, that I agreed to this role of an invisible shadow, to eternal second place, so that my success would again be insignificant. Compared to my sister's achievements, even if her only achievement was the ability to charm rich men and take advantage of it. I turned to the guests, feeling rage boiling up inside me, but instead of shouting, I spoke in a flat, cold voice that I knew was much more attention-grabbing than shouting. "I must admit," I said, looking around the room, "I'm certainly very pleased to see how many people have come to support Jessica and Charles, because it seems I was the only one who didn't know that this evening was dedicated to their engagement." There was a tense silence in the hall, the smiles on their faces began to slowly fade, and even my mother, who had been beaming with happiness, suddenly froze, as if she had just realized what I had said. "It's a strange coincidence," I continued, without taking my eyes off her, "because I paid for this evening, thinking that it would be in honor of my promotion, the one that I thought you were all so proud of." I could hear someone coughing in the corner, someone shifting awkwardly from one foot to the other, and Jessica, who had been enjoying the attention, suddenly tensed, her back straightened, and her gaze darted to our parents, expecting them to somehow resolve the situation, but this time I was going to give them that opportunity. "There must have been a mistake," my mother's voice rang out, and she laughed. But there was not the lightness in her laugh that I was used to. It was strained, nervous, the kind of laughter that comes from a person who has been caught in a lie. A mistake? I repeated, feeling anger throbbing in my chest. No, Mom, it's not a mistake at all. It's quite natural, because all my life you and Dad have been doing exactly that, ignoring me, erasing my achievements, putting Jessica on a pedestal, and now you haven't even considered it necessary to tell me that my own celebration has turned into a celebration in her honor. I saw how my father wanted to intervene, how he was about to say something threatening, but I did not give him such an opportunity, taking a step forward and meeting his gaze. You threatened me, Dad, I said calmly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. He said that if I ruined the evening, you would completely disown me, disinherit me, cut me out of the family, but you know what? It's not a threat, it's a release. The silence was deafening now. Grandma and Grandpa looked shocked, Uncle Robert frowned, and Aunt Susan covered her mouth with her hand, shocked by my words. Jessica opened and closed her mouth as if she didn't know what to say, and Charles just watched the scene with an expression of extreme discomfort, clearly realizing that he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I'm tired, I said, tired of trying to earn your love, tired of proving myself worthy of attention, tired of pretending that I'm happy being a backup in your family. And if your condition for remaining a part of it is to silently accept any humiliation, then no, thank you, this is not for me. I set the glass down on the table so carefully that the sound of glass hitting the surface was especially clear, as if emphasizing the finality of my decision, then turned around and, without saying another word, headed for the exit. I didn't look back. I didn't try to see their reaction. I just left the house, got into my car and drove away, feeling the tension leave my body with every kilometer, and my heart was filled with freedom, which I had never felt before. I was where I was meant to be, and for the first time in my life, this place was not determined by anyone's expectations, did not depend on parental approval or comparison with my sister. It belonged only to me, because every step, every victory, every decision was solely mine, and I knew that everything I achieved was not an accident. It was not the result of someone's connections or patronage. It was my personal, deserved victory. 3 years have passed since that evening when I left my parents' house, but I have never looked back, never doubted the correctness of my decision, because what seemed like a sharp break at the time turned out to be liberation, the final breaking of the chains that I have worn all my life, even if not realizing this. My parents didn't try to fix the situation, didn't try to apologize or rethink their attitude towards me. They just cut me out of their lives, just as easily as they cut out an unnecessary expense item from the family budget, and I, in turn, did the same, only, unlike them, I didn't lose nothing of value. Jessica stayed with them. Her life turned into an endless cycle of unfulfilled hopes, shattered illusions, and unsuccessful attempts to regain the status she was used to, but without Charles, without his money and his connections, without the ability to charm someone else enough to take responsibility for her existence. She had to face a reality that she was completely unprepared for. I heard that she tried to get a job, but it didn't last long. Every position seemed below her level to her. Every assignment from her superiors was perceived as a personal insult, and in the end, she just returned to the same state she had always been in, dependence on her parents, waiting for someone else will solve her problems, unwillingness to admit that her life is the result of her own decisions. I did not feel schadenfreude. I did not feel satisfaction from her fall, because it was inevitable, and I realized a long time ago that I was responsible only for my life, for my successes, for my achievements, and if someone chooses the path of inaction and complaining, it is his choice, but I will never allow it again. Imagine being a part of this drama. My grandparents remain my closest people, my mentors, my family in the best sense of the word. We met every Sunday, as before, for dinner, which my grandmother always cooked with special love, and these evenings became for me what I once wanted my family to be. But it has never been a place where you are loved just like that, without conditions, without requirements, without having to prove your worth. Last week, when I was officially appointed the youngest CEO in the history of Meridian Financial, The first thing I did was go to them, because they were the ones who supported me, who believed in me, who never doubted that I was capable of achieving anything I desired. When I entered their house, Grandma was sitting in her usual place by the window, and Grandpa was fiddling with a bottle of champagne, which, as it turned out, he was saving for this very moment. And when I told them the news, Grandma threw up her hands, her eyes filled with tears of pride, and Grandpa, smiling, finally uncorked the bottle. After making a toast that seemed to perfectly reflect everything I had to go through. To authenticity, he said, raising his glass. I smiled and, looking at them, at the people who had become a real family for me, I quietly added, and for finding my own way. At that moment, I knew that I was finally where I always should have been.